Now that action's nice and snappy. No resistance there, or no undue resistance. Okay, so those parts are good. We've done those pieces. I'll pop them to one side. Let's look at these housings. As mentioned, they're slightly different in construction, but they do the same job. And what have we got to do? We've got to get these pieces in there. In both cases, there are spring-loaded buttons, top and bottom, that hold these pieces together. So the springs are usually somewhat compressed and compacted after 60 years of sitting around, so I normally just give them a little stretch. And I'm probably not lengthening the spring by much at all. Only probably less than a millimetre. Yeah, certainly somewhere around that region, certainly no more than a millimetre. So that's all we need to do there. Now, to get these buttons in place, I start with a bit of synthetic grease. Run it in there just so that the buttons will move smoothly in those pockets, and the hole is where the pin on the button runs. To get these things together, the spring goes into the hole in the button. It doesn't go on the shaft. Put it on the shaft and you won't like it. And the buttons are the same. They go in top and bottom. The pin ensures they'll only go in one way. And holding that compressed with my finger from underneath, I can put the one on this side in place. So I've got my buttons compressed. I can take the housing and slide this on from the back, push it right through. Those pieces are now together. And I just have to do the same to the other one. Again, line that up on the tracks, top and bottom, and slide that through. Now I can check the feel of those, make sure that they do slide in fairly smoothly. That one seemed a bit stiffer. Sometimes if this housing has been pushed in, if you've been over enthusiastic thumping the screws to get them loose, this could be pushed in and then it will be too tight. And the answer of course is just to stretch it out slightly. That one certainly does. Oh, it's pretty good. That'll be fine once it's lubricated. Right, so there's our two housings. Now for the lubrication. There aren't, if you look inside these, you'll see there's not actually many points of contact between the inner and outer piece. Certainly on that rail, top and bottom, that the part slides on. and I can just work that in. That went well. Now the other points of contact are where the spring-loaded buttons run on the housing, particularly at the top where it runs across that rangefinder track. So I'll put some grease there, and there, there, and there. Now this housings are quite rough at that point. Now I know the inner doesn't touch it there, but that roughness must have been where something was rubbed off it during the manufacturing process. Perhaps there was a roughness on the casting there and it was filed. Well, that little piece that just popped off there was one of those little inserts. It needs to be pressed in place. And probably if the hole's a little bit oversized, it'll fall out. There's our two components. They're ready to go in the camera bodies. We put those to one side because there's jobs to be done here first. Before we can put those in, we need to put our transfer shafts back in the bodies. This is the shaft that runs through from the back of the camera and couples the cocking rack through to the shutter to cock it. So, to deal with these, we need some synthetic grease, medium generous amount of that on there, and it pops into the body. There's a little hole visible at the back that shaft drops into. And the same for its mate on the other camera. Are those shafts identical? Yes, there's no difference in construction there. And these are held in place with a little right angle bracket. That's held into the body casting with a single screw from the top, and it's a small short round-headed screw. I'll just run that screw in loosely and do the same for its mate over here. Now what else can we do here? Oh, while we've got these pieces out, there's a piece that needs to go in, and that's called the sleeve that the shutter release will run down. So if you hold down this finger here, you can slide this in from the back and close this up. The sleeve is now trapped, it can't fall out. And we'll do the same with this side. The bracket that holds this shaft in place also supports the rack at the back. It stops the rack from flapping about in the wind, if you like. So the distance, the amount of clearance you've got here at the back for the rack is quite important, because if that's too wide, it means that the rack can float backwards and forwards and will only be contacting part of the width of that gear on the end of that shaft. And if it's only contacting part of the width of the gear, it means that it's going to fail considerably sooner than if it was running across the full width of the teeth in that gear. So the spacing there is quite important, and I just set those up so that the rack has a sufficient clearance that it'll run smoothly. And I've found from experience that 4/1000ths of an inch is just the right amount of clearance. So I'll find the racks and have a look at them. As I inspect the racks, I'm looking at the teeth and I'm running my finger over the face of the rack feeling for any roughness. If there's any roughness there, it means that the metal's been pushed away from the teeth. It's been spread out to the sides. I'm feeling a little bit on the teeth at the top there. And on the other one, there's certainly roughness on these teeth at the bottom part of the rack on this face. And at the upper part of the rack, a little bit of the same. So what I want to do is I don't want to file these. You don't want to file the teeth, because if you're filing something, basically you're removing metal. We don't want to remove metal. What we want to do is push metal back to where it should be. I'll take these racks in turn. And what I'm doing is I've got a hammer here, and I'm just going to tap that very lightly over those rough edges of the teeth, and basically it's just pushing metal back over onto the teeth. Now these are only brass, and the pieces of metal we're dealing with here are only very, very tiny. So you don't need to thump at it, you just need to not do much more than drop that hammerhead onto it. Well, that one's good. Mind you, that started out pretty good. I'm just checking. I'm going to hold it against the light and check the pattern of the teeth, and see if I see any unevenness at all. That one looks absolutely fine. I'll pop that to one side. Now its mate here, this was the one that felt a little bit rougher. And I'll hold that up to the light too. Not entirely sure about the last couple of teeth at the bottom part of this rack. Now I've got a rack from a Retina IIIc Reflex 3 here, which is quite a hard steel rack. Same tooth profile, and I'm checking how they mesh together. I'll hold that up to the light. That actually looks pretty good. I don't think I've got any problem with either of those racks. So we'll carry on and install them. So starting with this one. I'm putting this in dry at the moment because I'm just doing this to set up that bracket. I've got a 4/1000th of an inch, which it tells me is 0.102 millimeters. I'll slide that shim down behind it, loosen the screw, push it back towards the back of the camera, tighten the screw, check that the action of the rack is nice and smooth. That seems to be good. That'll do nicely. So we'll say that one's good. And its mate here will do exactly the same job with that, with its own rack. I always do this with the rack that's out of the camera, or the rack you're going to be installing into the camera. So loosen that screw off slightly, slide that feeler gauge down behind it, push it back against the back of the camera, retighten the screw. That one does not feel as smooth. I'm just looking at the state of that bracket to make sure that it's sitting square. It looks like it's off. No, that's good. That seems to work fine. Okay, so again we'll say that that one's good. I want to lock the position of those two screws with a touch of lacquer. It would be even better to lock the position of the brackets inside the camera body, but it's not really feasible to get at that. So I'll just put a spot of lacquer in here. And that's just to ensure that that screw doesn't work loose and allow that bracket to drift. Okay, so we've got our two camera bodies and they're ready to have their shroud and assembly put back inside. So that just slides in. I've got the lens standard in the collapsed position because otherwise I'm likely to lose that sleeve that's in there. So just push that back into the body and there are 4 screws that hold it in place. Now the screws from the base of the camera have normally got the residue of glue on them. They may well have rusty marks on them too for good measure. And the 2 prettiest screws typically go at the top. Now prettier is a relative term because they're likely to be a little bit more distorted than the screws that held the rewind, the bush for the rewind shaft in place, because these screws are usually done up tighter. So I've got my 4 screws in place. I can tighten them up. That's that one. Now its mate over here, the same thing, except this one has got inserts in the shroud, and I know from experience that they are likely to fall out if I breathe on them wrong, so I've got to get these screws started very gently indeed. I don't want to push the inserts through, because otherwise it's fiddly putting them back. Now I think in this camera one of the inserts on the base came adrift while I was working on it, or while I was taking it apart, but this particular insert here is prone to coming away because it's got very little metal around it supporting it. So it's not held in as firmly. Okay, 2 more to go, and one of these is loose and will fall out at the drop of a hat. And we're about to find out which one. Screw hole might not be lined up particularly well. That's not looking square to me. That one's going in. It only leaves one. It's going in. Nope, that was the insert falling out. Alright, I've got to get that insert pressed back into place. And that's always a bit of a nuisance. Okay, let me cover the insert. And I've got to slide that into place. And try and hold it there while I'm putting the screw in from the other side. Sorry you can't see what I'm doing, but as it happens I can't really see what I'm doing either. Okay, I think I've got that pushed down into place. I'm going to see if I can hold it in place with the pair of tweezers, the back of a pair of tweezers, and get the screw started from the top. Yeah, we're winning. It worked, it worked. Okay. 4 screws in place, get the 4 screws tightened up. Now, at this point, if I pulled the front out, I'm in danger of that sleeve coming loose, so I don't dare do that. I need to deal with the shutter release shafts and put them loosely in place. Now our shutter release shafts, this is what we had. One was a 1-piece arrangement and one was a 2-piece arrangement. Now, what are they like in terms of size? Well, the 2-piece arrangement is exactly the same size when the extra piece is put in place as the 1-piece construction. And what are we to make of that? Well, I've pondered on this for some time, and I don't know why anyone would want to make a shaft like this in 2 pieces when one would do the job. One possibility is that when this piece was manufactured, they simply made a lot of them to the drawing, and the drawing was incorrect. And instead of tossing them out and starting fresh, they simply machined these sleeves to go on there. And at a later date, when they did the next run, they actually changed their drawing and made the piece correctly the first time. That's the only thing that really comes to mind as far as I can tell for the way these are made. Certainly there are other cases of the camera, particularly with early examples, where something had obviously been made wrong and it had been rectified, or there'd been a change of design and it still showed features from the earlier design. But that's the deal with these two things. They're exactly the same length. It's just one is in 2 pieces and one is in 1 piece. So I'll slide them into place. Now I'm just going to wipe this with a bit of molybdenum paste. Just a tiny amount, and then slide that into place. And body number 1, that's the earlier of the 2 cameras. And this one, I'm doing exactly the same to it. If anything, the finish on this is better. The other one had a bit of a rougher surface finish. But there they are, both of them are in place in the bodies and work nicely. Of course I don't want them falling out, so we're going to have to see about tying them in place somehow shortly.